Investment research on stock markets? Wants to go for a walk outside the house with a friend? Introducing iCapital, where you can get investment advice on the go. It is accessible via app and website. Subscribe now to iCapital for stock news. iCapital is reliable because they thoroughly research listed companies, economies, and stock markets. iCapital provides a clear perspective of how markets interact and how it influences your investment. When investors and traders are debating whether to buy or sell their stocks, fret not, as iCapital will recommend Malaysian and global stocks. iCapital is available on Apple App Store, Google Play Store, and Huawei App Gallery. Download it now.
Are we playing the video? Hi, welcome to another live session today. Our topic today, if you have seen, is called Beyond the Surface, examining the struggles of developed nations, Japan, Britain, and the United States. Should being a typical developed country be the benchmark then? I hope you find the title interesting. I suppose it depends on how the definition of a developed or developing country is made, and then whether Malaysia wants, based on that definition, whether Malaysia wants to be a developed country or still remain as a developing country. Because the Malaysian government, not just the current one, but most of the Malaysian governments have been saying that our aspiration is to be high income. Now, high income and developed, they are not the same. They are not. There's a lot of overlapping, but they are not equal to one another. So in the past, remember when we spoke about the ringgit and so on, and then I mentioned that Singapore is a developing country. A few of the audience say that I was wrong, and they say Singapore is a developed country. Technically, no. Technically, I'm right. I know my facts. Singapore, the country itself, calls Singapore a developing country. Singapore doesn't want to be called a developed country. So if you think that Singapore is a developed country because it is high income, that is a different definition, right? If you look at the Singapore Statistics Department, they will say that we are a developing country and we support our fellow developing countries. So it will be quite a shock for many of you. In fact, I think it will be shocking to all of you that Singapore describes itself as a developing country. How can, you're so rich, you're so blah, 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 and so on and so forth. How can you be a developing country? So this is where you got to be clear about the usage of the terms, about the definition first, right? So our title is Beyond the Surface. That means don't just look at the top. Don't just look at the Hokkaido, the ski resort in Hokkaido. Don't just look at the British Museum in London. Don't just look at the Statue of Liberty in New York. Go beyond that. Go below the surface, and then look at the struggles that these so-called developed countries are facing, and then ask ourselves whether Malaysia, given the struggles that these countries are facing, would Malaysia want to be a high-income country, a developed country, or something else altogether? Is there another model? Is there an alternative model to these categories, these kind of classifications that have been used for the last few, I think since the end of World War II, right? The first point to understand is the confusion, because globally, whether it's IMF, the World Bank, or WTO, and so on, there's no commonly agreed definition of what is a developed country or a developing country. Right? That's the problem with economists. We've got so many different types of definitions and interpretations that we cannot agree among ourselves. But high income, there is pretty straightforward. High income is okay if your GDP per capita income is 2,000, 4,000, then you classify as low income, right? If you're like Malaysia, at about 12,000 US dollars per capita income, then you are considered as middle income. Then within middle income, you have the lower and upper middle income again, but generally it's middle income. Then you have those like Singapore, 50, 60,000 US dollars GDP per capita, that's high income. Japan, right, and so on. So if you look at high income, the definitions are a lot clearer because it's just based on one or two single factor to define, to categorize. Developed versus developing is a lot more difficult. But today, the topic is not about what is the definition of developing. I think all of us can agree that Japan, Britain, and United States are considered as developed countries. I think that is something that all of us can agree. Right? Now, if that is the case, then using that as a benchmark, do we want Malaysia to be a developed country? So I think what we want to share is that what we're going to aspire to, we have to be clear, because if you look at what has been happening, take the case of Japan first, right? We look at Japan, maybe you only see Japan in terms of the Shinjuku, the Ginza area in Tokyo, and then you say, wow, that's so great. But that's only on the surface. If, from a demographic point of view, Japan's population is not only aging, it's the fastest aging population, right? But it's not only aging, it's also declining in absolute numbers very rapidly. The Japanese population has been declining for 12 years in a row. And the last count that they had was in 2022. There were 500,000 fewer Japanese in 2022 compared to 2021. Now, that is if you include some foreign residents coming in. But if you just take into account what is known as the natural change in population, that means just looking at the death and the birth of Japanese, not counting the foreigners coming in, there were fewer, in 2022, there were 731,000 fewer Japanese compared with 2021. And this is the 12th year that the Japanese population has been declining. So you may ask, what's the big deal, if the population is declining? The only problem is that in the case of Japan, it is also aging rapidly. And that gives rise to quite a lot of social economic issues. For example, the Japanese people generally as a whole don't welcome migrants. They are not in favor of foreigners. Yeah? I hope my sound is better now, because a while ago the air condition in our office was quite loud, quite noisy. I don't know whether that was affecting the sound that you all can hear, but now we've switched off the aircon, and I hope the quality is better now. So the foreigners only account for about 2% of Japanese population. So Pew Research is a well-known research organization based in US. So they did a survey in 2021, right, by Pew Research, and they found that more than 50% of the Japanese say that they don't welcome migrants. They feel that having a diverse society, which is, of course, where you have got a lot of non-Japanese inside, would make Japan a worse country to live in. So now, declining population, aging population, and you don't welcome foreigners. because that's the attitude. They are very insular in that sense. But what is also unknown to outsiders when you go to your 5-day trip to Hakone or Kyushu, whatever it is, Japan in 2022, last year, is the most expensive place in the world to raise a child. I mean, maybe that can explain to you why there are so few births in Japan, because it's the most expensive place to raise a child. And what has worsened is that the Japanese economy from 1990, where that was when their big bubble went bust, the property bubble and the stock market bubble, right? The stock market bubble was so big that the Nikkei index in December 1989 reached a high of 39,000 points. That's 1989. Now we are 34 years later, the Nikkei index is still 20% below that 39,000 points. So that's how big the bubble was. So since then, the Japanese economy has hardly grown. They are rich, but they have been stagnant at the wealthy level, and it's been declining. So if you look at the average annual household income, that means adjusted for inflation and so on, in 1995, the average annual household income was about 50,000 US dollars. This is, if you put in yen, it's about 6.6 million yen. That is 1995. Then by 2020, just before the pandemic, right, it has dropped from 5.6 million yen to only 5.64 million yen. And in US dollar terms, it has dropped from about 51,000 US dollars to about 43,000 US dollars. So in a period of 25 years, the real household income has been declining. So, I mean, you wouldn't be surprised that people don't want to give birth, don't want to raise a family, because your income is falling and the cost of raising a child is the most expensive in the world. Then what does that mean? It creates quite a number of tragic consequences for Japan. First thing is, the metropolitan area of Tokyo has about 38 million people, which is large. So because of that, it attracts a lot of people from outside Tokyo, right? First thing is, the countryside are all becoming empty. If you go to Japan, don't just go to Tokyo, don't just go to Hokkaido, go to the countryside where it's deserted, where they have not have a child for 30 years, 40 years, where they have to, it's so bad that there are actually millions of houses that are unoccupied in Japan. Millions, not talking about thousands, millions all over. So you have this problem where Japan is about 125 million people. 37, 38 is in Tokyo. So can you imagine how concentrated it is? And this pooling of population of the Japanese people in Tokyo has created not just the emptiness, the emptying of the rural Japan, but it has also made Tokyo so crowded that the Japanese government is paying the Japanese families to leave Tokyo. Starting this year, April 2023, right? Families in Tokyo, in the metropolitan area, will be eligible to receive 1 million yen, or about 7,700 US dollars per child if the family leaves Tokyo. So can you imagine? The same thing happens here, right? Malaysian government says, okay, Mr. Lim, Encik Ali, Encik Mutu, if you can take your child and your family to leave Klang Valley, to go to I don't know, Gerantu, to go to Rompin, I will pay you maybe 500,000 ringgit. So that's how bad the situation in Tokyo And in Japan, is that and this encouraging the families to move away from Tokyo, the one I mentioned to you, that where they pay $1 million yen, it's not the first time the Japanese government is doing it. They have tried a few times and it failed in the past. Right? So Japan has got the most crowded. It's got 38 million people, and it's got the lowest fertility rate in the whole of Japan. So what I'm trying to show is that from a superficial, from the outsider's point of view, it looks great. You're about 50 to 60,000 US dollars per capita, you're affluent, and so on and so forth. You're so successful, you know. But internally, if you look beyond the surface, you dig deeper, it is a country that is decaying. It is a country that is deteriorating in socio-economic conditions. And actually quite a lot of Japanese have migrated to US and so on that do not want to go back to Japan. So then we have to ask ourselves, if Japan is a developed country, do we, Malaysia, aspire to be such a developed country? It's not a theoretical question, it's a practical question. And then when you go for elections, when you go and meet your politicians, these are the questions that you can ask your member of parliament or your state assemblyman. I'm very sure the MPs and the state assemblymen will not be able to answer you because they have not thought about such questions before. They'll be wondering, how on earth you can ask them such difficult questions? But ask them, because it will determine what your future will be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, or when you retire 30 years from now. It determines the quality of your future, the quality of your retirement, the quality that your children will be facing. Now that's Japan, right? You all can only see the superficial success of Japan. The same thing with Great Britain. I call Great Britain has deteriorated so bad that I call Great Britain now the Little Britain, although they're still trying to be Great Britain, right? And I will share, because I did some of the research, and then I'll share with you a real story of this person by the name of what is his name? I cannot remember his name. Thomas. Right? Thomas. He lives in a place 200 miles north of London, in a seaside town called Morecambe. Right? About 200 miles. So he is 60 years old, and he's a veteran of the 1982 Falklands War that Britain fought Argentina, right? And when the journalists approached him, interviewed him, he says, sometimes I've gone for 2 to 3 days without having money to buy food, without food. This is developed Britain. I mean, if you hear the story from somewhere in Palembang, Sumatra, you may say, yeah, they're so poor, or somewhere in one of the kampong in Malaysia, say, yeah, Malaysia is so backward. This is Britain. And this person is a veteran of their Falkland War in 1982. And he goes without food. Now, the journalist described his home. The journalist went to his home and says, they found Dusty Thomas, huddled under a cotton blanket. That means the blanket is made of cotton. He doesn't have a proper blanket, right? In his chilly first floor home just outside Morecambe, where his central heating, the heat for his place, has not been switched on for 3 years. London is pretty cold. Damn chilly. If you go 200 miles north, you're getting closer to the Scottish border. That's even colder. And he has not switched on his heating for 3 years, and he goes without food for 2 to 3 days and in a row. I mean, if I don't tell you he is Dusty Thomas, I didn't tell you that he lives 200 miles north of London. If I just describe his situation, you say, oh, yeah, maybe this guy is from somewhere in Mindanao in Philippines, or somewhere in Somalia, or somewhere like that. This is Great Britain, developed country. I mean, this is just one example, right? This is from the official UK statistics. 30% of the children in Britain live in poverty. 30%. That is, out of every 10 children, 3 to 4 UK British children are living in poverty. I mean, you say that in Malaysia, situation is bad. My God, can you imagine if you migrate to Great Britain, a developed country, and you find out that this is what the reality is? 1 in 4 British is facing financial difficulty or is already in financial difficulty. And 10%, 1 out of 10 British miss paying bills, whether it's utility bills and so on and so forth. And the figures I gave you are not plucked out the air by Mr. Tan. These are figures from the UK government. These are official figures. So that is on their poverty side. And if I unfortunately I don't have I should have captured this photo. They showed this lady by the name of Alison Tyson in her bedroom, that she turns on the central heating only when her children visits her, because she cannot afford to turn on the central heating. This is also in the same town as Morecambe as the Dusty Thomas that I mentioned earlier. UK is facing, because the inflation rate in UK is really bad. It hasn't come down. It has peaked somewhat, but it's still at the 8-9% level. Our inflation officially is about 3%. UK is 3 times our inflation, right? And the UK interest rates are still going up. The last round, they increased by 50 basis points. Ours, last week, our Bank Negara didn't increase our interest rate. So the interest rates are still going up. It's already at a high level. So what the consequence of this is that Britain is facing a mortgage crisis, a mortgage catastrophe, where millions of British people will be pushed into insolvency because they cannot afford to pay the mortgages. That's one. And then I thought, I always complain about IS Selangor. Of course, they have done a lousy job. There's so many water disruptions and so on. Then when I read about the water crisis in Britain, the developed Britain, I hope IS Selangor doesn't read about this, because then IS Selangor say, we're doing a better job than the water utility in UK. That's horrible. But what has happened is, for example, Thames Water. Thames Water is the biggest water utility in Britain. Yeah, the biggest one. They got 15 million customers. So what has happened is that they were supposed to have reinvested in repairing the pipes and so on and so forth, right? Maintaining and improving the water system. But they didn't do it. They were slow. So the money that they had from the customers and the debt that they borrow, you know what they did? They have been paying out generous dividends to the shareholders. So this MP in Britain calculated that since Thames Water was privatized in 1989 up to now, Thames Water, not Thames Water, the industry as a whole has paid £72 billion in dividends. and yet they did not invest in the infrastructure of their water, facilities. So the UK, the Britain as a whole is facing a water crisis because they've been paying dividends and they didn't invest. So in our case, maybe it's worse, IS Selangor never paid us a single cent of dividend, and yet they make a mess of our water facilities. In that case, you could say, well, at least I got back something in the form of dividend. But it shouldn't be that way. You shouldn't be rewarding a few of your shareholders at the expense of 15 million of your customers. And now what Thames Water wants to do is, because they're going to go into insolvency, they're going to go into bankruptcy. What the Thames Water wants the British government to do is to bail them out. Okay, that is developed Britain, right? Which, when you go to London, wow, you look at the Tower of London, you look at the Parliament House, so great. Look deeper, go into the lives of the ordinary British, and I'm sure many of them will say, maybe I might migrate to Malaysia. It seems like a much better country for me. Then US, the land of freedom, where everybody has the freedom to buy a gun and shoot anyone that you want to. America has been facing crisis after crisis. This is the most powerful country in the world, a rich country, GDP per capita, 50 to 60,000 US dollars, a bit slower than Singapore, but at a high level. And they have been having a opiate drug crisis, right? For example, the leading cause of death for Americans aged from 18 to 49 is fentanyl. Fentanyl is a synthetic drug, and that is the leading cause of death for Americans aged from 18 to 49, right? And I give you some statistics. The death caused by drugs was 5.7 per 100,000 in 2016. 5.7 per 100,000. 5 years later, the deaths from drugs shot up to 21.6 per 100,000. That is an increase of 400% in 5 years. And I'll have shared with you so far are statistics, but let me just add in a bit of an anecdotal story. I have people who are in San Francisco, and they're shocked. The last time I went to San Francisco was November 2019, before the pandemic lockdown. You can see the amount of homeless people, the amount of people openly taking drugs. And in San Francisco, I was so amused, because if you steal something below $1,000 US, it's not considered a crime. Only if it's above 1,000. So the shops in many of the downtown San Francisco, by a certain time, they close their shop because theft, burglary is so high. And then this friend of mine, customer of mine, who just came back from Vancouver recently, not too long ago, just about, I think, 2 months ago, he was shocked at Vancouver. Vancouver is supposed to be a beautiful city. He says the number of homeless people, the number of drug addicts openly in the street. And he actually saw so many of the local people there in Vancouver injecting themselves with drugs openly in the street. So what you see in your encounter matches with the official statistics, right? Then, of course, the US government, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, will blame it on Mexico. Why are you allowing people to smuggle drugs? Blame it on China, blame it on everybody else, blame it on every country in the world, except they don't blame it on themselves. Because the cause of the problem is the White House. The White House, where the US president stays. If you have been following headlines, right, recently, they found a bag of powder in White House, in the lobby of the White House, a bag of white powder. And then their so-called security people investigated, and they found that it was cocaine. Cocaine found in the White House. Okay. I mean, if you translate that, this is developed country supposed to be telling people, the rest of the world, that look, my country, my democracy is the best in the world. And then you found a bag of strange white powder, which turned out to be cocaine, in the lobby of the house of the president. Can you imagine if that happens to, say, a country like Malaysia? You find ganja in the house of our prime minister? Oh my God. I don't want to be such a developed country, right? Because here you are accusing every country in the world of worsening the drug problem in America, and then your White House has got cocaine. The investigators said that they can do the investigation fast, and this is to quote the investigators. They say that the officials who are investigating it have very low expectations that they'll be able to identify the person who put in the cocaine. They have low expectations. Now, to me, I think the whole thing is being covered up. Because in the White House, you have all the CCTV cameras, you have all the cameras all over the White House. Can't you switch on the CCTV to see who it is? Right? And then, before your investigation has started, your officials, your investigators have already told us, hey, most likely we cannot find who's the culprit, So please don't expect any. Gosh, don't you think this is a cover-up? The White House is under top security, a lot of cameras, right? And then you tell people, sorry, I cannot find the culprit, even though I've not started the investigation yet. So I don't know, maybe it's Joe Biden's son, I don't know. But this is developed America. And then in America, I'm just giving you the opiate crisis as an example. America has been facing crisis after crisis. The mass shooting for this year, 2023, is already exceeded past records, right? And nobody seems to be able to do anything. They keep on talking about the freedom under their constitution. I don't understand. When your constitution is out of tune with reality, when your constitution is obsolete, is already out of date, why can't you amend the constitution? Right? Isn't that a very simple thing to do? I mean, the constitution is so holy, so sacrosanct, that you cannot even do a bit of amendment, even though so many thousands of Americans, especially young children, are being killed every year. And for God, they are developed America, they are developed countries. We, as developing country, we cannot lecture them. So I'm just sharing with you the US situation. I'm just giving you the opiate crisis. Of course, you have inflation, right? If you look at the report, job employment report, the economic report from the US in the last week or so, you're almost guaranteed that the US Federal Reserve is going to increase the interest rate again in July. And another time. And if they cannot bring down the inflation, which is puzzling, because 6 months ago, let's say about December, right, 2022, the wage growth, the core inflation rate in US was already at about the same level as now. As now means May, June. So within that 6 months, the wage growth has not fallen, the core inflation has not fallen. So what has happened to your monetary policy? You've been increasing interest rate all the time. And you're going to increase another 2 times, 3 times? That will affect not just America, other countries, developing countries like us. Our ringgit will be affected. And if you affect our ringgit, it's going to also cause a lot of direct and indirect consequences for the Malaysian economy. So Why want to be a developed country? Why should Malaysia aspire to be a developed country when you cause so many problems for your own citizens and you cause problems for the rest of the world? Then come back to the earlier question, right? As to whether you want to be high income or developed. Now, just a quick economics 101. Brunei is high income because of the oil and so on and so forth, right? It's high income. But Brunei, you ask anybody, is Brunei a developed country? Almost 99% say no, because it doesn't have the economic structure, the appropriate economic structure. It doesn't have the technology. It doesn't have the education system that defines a developed economy, right? Now, Singapore, which would qualify based on all angles, refuses to be called a developed country, right? So, in the case of Malaysia, where are we? If you look at Britain, Japan, and US, you compare Malaysia with them, you say, no, we're not developed. But if you compare us with, say, some of the poor African countries, yeah, of course, Malaysia looks like as if it's developed. So, a country like Malaysia is very hard to categorize. We are somewhere in between developed and developing. And more importantly, does it matter? Right? So, when you talk to your politicians, when you talk to your MP or your state assemblyman, bear this in mind that a lot of developed countries are struggling more than us in Malaysia, and tell the politicians, look, whether it's high income, whether it's developed country, it doesn't matter. Whether our GDP grow at 3%, 7%, it doesn't matter. All that matters really fundamentally when you look at the basic is, what is the quality of our life? What is the quality of our future? Right? If we have good quality, I mean, a country, to take a straight example like Bhutan, doesn't bother. They don't have GDP. They have gross happiness. A gross happiness. They measure how happy the people are. And they will restrict the number of tourists that can go into Bhutan every year so that you don't go and destroy the environment. You don't go and build all those ugly skyscrapers, all those buildings, and then you have landslides and all those. They preserve the environment, is very pristine, and people there are happy. So maybe we should reorient it. We should redirect our politicians to make sure that they ask the right question, so that all of us, whether like me, 70 years old, or the 7-year-old kid, would have good quality of life and good quality future. Good quality of life doesn't mean that you have to be like in the case of Brunei and so on, where you got 60,000 US per capita income. It could be like Bhutan. Their quality of life is good. So in our case, of course, we cannot go down to the way of Bhutan because a lot of things you have to give up, you have to sacrifice, which I'm sure many of you wouldn't be prepared to sacrifice, right? But it could be like simple things like give us good quality parks, public parks that are high quality, that is safe, that you can go at any time you want. For example, make sure that traffic jams are all overcome. Make sure that our women, our lady, our women folks can walk in the streets of Malay, of KL, of JB anytime they want to. So you don't have to be developed and high income to do that, right? So I hope when you meet your assemblyman, state assemblyman, and your member of parliament, engage with him or her in a thought-provoking type of session, right? We don't want your free toll, we don't want your free whatever it is. We want good quality life, which encompasses a lot of good education, blah, blah, blah. And more importantly, a future that has got good quality. Okay, can we maybe look at some comments? Alex Tan says, very interesting story. Thank you, Alex, because a lot of times you look up to the developed countries, but that's only superficial. And the example I gave you in Vancouver and San Francisco are just two. I have another person, he went with 14 of his friends to Europe to Italy recently. There are 15 of them. Venice, Rome. They were robbed in every city in Italy. And the thieves there are so smart that this friend of mine was having his backpack, and his things were stolen from his backpack without even him knowing it. It was much later when he wanted to look for his wallet and found that, oh gosh, everything is gone. And not just him, and not just in Rome. So, and I have another friend who just came back who took the mother to Switzerland. Oh gosh, the mother, after the first day, wanted to come back because the mother couldn't get rice. Where's rice? Cannot get noodles, cannot get all those things. Eric Lee, Great Britain is Little Britain. US is land where you can buy a gun to shoot anyone. So Eric Lee asked, do we have an apt description of Australia? Maybe Eric, maybe you can share with us how you describe Australia. Liu Sengki is, I cannot see the question. Okay. With all these troubles, the Japanese, UK, and US stocks on a rally still going up. Why is there a disconnect? Good question, Mr. Liu. Because first thing is, when these rallies go up, who benefit? You know, most of the minorities in America don't own shares. Only the higher income Americans own shares. That's why you see the income disparity in America is getting wider. In the case of Japan, the same thing, because the Japanese people don't trust their own stocks. Now you say, in the case of Japan, it's on a rally. Yes, it's on a rally, but it is still, after this rally, the Japanese index is still below the high that it reached in 1989 December. Let's say you take 32,000, 33,000, the high was 39,000. So it's about 6,000 to 7,000 points below the high that it reached in 34 years ago. I don't call that a rally, I call that a bear trap. In the case of UK, it's a bit different. The index is not, because the benchmark index for London is primarily global stocks. A lot of it are not UK. If you look at the smaller mid-sized caps for UK, they've actually plunged a lot. So it's only US that's been driven up, and that is because a lot of the investors are looking at thinking that the US federal, the interest rate has really peaked. But that rally, first thing is driven, especially on NASDAQ side, is driven by only the 6 mega tech stocks. Your Apple, your Meta, your Alphabet, only 6. You take that away, the US NASDAQ, for example, in 2020, in the last 12 months has been flat. It hasn't gone up. First thing. Second thing is, like I said, a lot of the ordinary Americans don't benefit from it. So the suffering, that's why you're having a social crisis in the developed countries. Why is it that in Europe, Germany, Greece, Italy, why is it that the far right are now becoming a lot more popular? Why is it that in the case of America, they're looking at the possibility of having a third party, that the popularity rating of Biden is below 40%. It's among the lowest for presidents, right? And then if you don't have Biden, you have Trump. So the Americans are so disillusioned with their democracy that, look, they're looking at maybe either different candidates or a third party. And the survey was done, I cannot remember what was done by which survey organization, but this was very recent. 5% of Americans believe that Joe Biden should run for re-election. Only 5%. So, yeah, you can have a stock market rally. If you're an investor, great. But if you're the ordinary person who maybe the wage income and so on and so forth, who don't really benefit from this kind of rally, then you say there's no disconnect because the economic realities are harsh. The Vancouver and St. Rupert are the two major ports on Western Canada, right? A lot of the imports from Asia, go through these ports, and then they get distributed down to the United States. They're on strike. They've been on strike for 1 week, and they refuse. So if the American Maritime Workers Trade Union also work together with the Canadian Trade Union, then the imports, the goods coming from Asia will be stuck. You're going to have supply chain disruption again. And then we fit into inflation again. So this kind of strikes is not just happening in Canada, it's happening in US, it's happening in UK. UK is the land of strikes. Germany. You find that the ordinary people are suffering because they are not able to keep up with the increasing cost of living. Or other social issues. France, where you read recently, right, in Paris, there have been endless riots because the police shot an Algerian French person who didn't stop the traffic light. So there have been riots. So you find that what is happening at the society level, at the broad society level, doesn't get reflected in the stock market, in the stock market index. There's a disconnect. You're totally correct. And which would I prefer if I have to choose? I would prefer the index to be lower, but the whole society, the whole country is a lot happier. From Tiao Chiat, is Australia a good example of development and high quality of life? I would say no, because the Australia's first thing is the housing debt is pretty high. The economy is very narrowly based. It is still a resource base, whether it's coal, iron ore, and then to add in a little bit tourism and education, right? And high quality of life, it depends on how you define it. The sufferings that I mentioned to you in Great Britain, US, are also being experienced in Australia. If you read or you listen, for those of you who have Astro, they got the ABC News. They have a live program called Q&A, question and answer, and a lot of social issues are brought up in this 1 hour program. And the number of issues that they raise is actually incredible. The number of problems, dissatisfaction is incredible. So I would, good example of development, high quality of life, I would have to use the example of Singapore. I mean, many of you may not agree, but that's my view, that's my opinion. I think a lot of Singaporeans won't agree with me. A lot of Singaporeans are still complaining, but that's because they haven't experienced what is outside Singapore. Public ownership is high, public houses, public accommodation is of high quality, and the government, the Singapore government up to now, this is already 2023, is 3 to 4 years after the pandemic. Of course, people may say that because next year's the election, they're still giving out cash, 400, 700 ringgit, $400, $700 to Singapore citizens, just like that. And as I mentioned in the past, we have a company in Singapore, we have a business in Singapore. During the pandemic, we received very generous financial support from the Singapore government. Even though our company is not owned by a Singaporean, it's owned by me, a Malaysian, we received a lot of financial support, no question asked, very efficient. So if you want to say good example of development high quality, I would say Singapore is a good one. And then don't accuse me of being pro-China. I'm just being anti-China. I would say China is also, Singapore is on the high income side. China is on the middle income side. China is a good example of a middle income country that's got a balance of development and high quality of life. I think I've traveled throughout China widely enough to be able to get feedback from poorer provinces, poorer cities to the rich cities, the local people, and from the statistics, from the research that I read, I think it is very, very hard to find people in China who are not happy with what they have. And survey after survey, whether it's done domestically by the Chinese government or by international organization, has a very high rating of satisfaction in the Chinese government. Their satisfaction in the government is something like 80-90%. That is incredible. So these are the two countries that I would be able to say that's a good example of development and high quality of life. And S.H. Tan says, Mr. Tan, thanks for the realization. Should Malaysia go for high income nation? It doesn't matter, because high income is a statistical number. High income could be skewed by a small number of Malaysians having really high income and a large majority of Malaysians not having that sufficiently level of income. So you have high income. Like I said, Brunei, for example, right? So Brunei is high income, but would you want to be that kind of country? I don't think I want to, right? I hope our Brunei friends don't get offended. Lambda Geek, how to tame, slow down the runaway inflation when all developed nations print money like there's no tomorrow to stimulate the economic growth. Yeah, I agree. It's not the fault of the consumers. It's basically two problems. One is the fiscal government, the fiscal stimulus of Trump and Biden were crazy. They spent 13 trillion US dollars in 2 to 3 years to stimulate the economy. That's absurd. That's even more than during the Great Depression. And then the other thing is the capitalist model, where companies want to maximize their profit. So every company wants to look at maintaining or increasing their profit margin. That will translate into higher prices. Liao YH, question is, do we have competent MPs in the first place? Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I have to agree with you whether we have competent MPs and state assemblymen, right? Especially when people keep asking you how long is the woman's skirt. Again, Lambda, Mr. Tay says, Mr. Tan, as yen expected to continue to depreciate, funds may continue to invest in Nikkei. High chances for Nikkei to break new highs in the next few months. I don't know. I find that Nikkei is in a bubble territory. It's overvalued, and all the negative things that you can think about China applies to Japan at even a more higher level. Aging population, China, Japan is worse, right? The public debt China has, Japan is the highest public debt in the world. So I think the Tokyo stock market is in bubble territory. Okay, I need to run away. I need to get off soon. Maybe I can just maybe because they asked about Eric Lee asked why his Singaporean friends migrated to Australia. Well, people have different objectives. People have different tastes, different desires. But the thing is, the number of people who are living in Singapore is far less than the number of people wanting to go to Singapore. I think that tells you a little bit. And Singapore, I mean, those who are Singaporeans want to live Australia, I guess, is like maybe Australia is not so competitive. People there are a bit more slower paced. And Saturday and Sunday, you can have your barbecue. And Friday by 4 o'clock, you can have your drinks. But I'm not sure why your friends are migrating and what kind of profile they have. Are they single? Do they have young kids? Are they educated and so on and so forth? I can't really answer, but I would think that the percentage in any country, there will always be a percentage of people who wants to migrate. But in the case of Singapore, I don't think the number of Singaporeans wanting to leave Singapore is not a high level. I guess we are coming close to about 12 o'clock. I've been told that my live sessions are too long, that my live session should be only like 5-10 minutes. Ours is like 1 hour, 1.5 hours. So I take that into consideration, and I hope you will like our social media. Share as many as you can. And more importantly is, if you want things a lot more detail and so on, you can always come and subscribe to our iCapital.biz, right? The newsletter, either in print or in internet edition. So I hope to see you all again next week. And whatever topics you want us to discuss, to bring up, please send your suggestion to us, and we'll definitely take a look. Thank you, and have a good weekend.